I have racked my brain for months. Well, okay, let's be honest. It's been over a year trying to figure out how I wanted to do a podcast, why I wanted to do a podcast, who I want to talk to in a podcast. Do I have time for a podcast? Of course you have time for a podcast. But how do I edit a podcast? How do I market a podcast? How do I launch a podcast? And this morning, God was like, why don't you just start by pressing record? So hi, my name is Uwem. You can call me Coach Uwem. You can call me Holy Hothead. You can call me pretty much, well, not whatever, either of those things. Please be nice. But I realized that I had some things that I needed to get off of my chest. And that's basically what this podcast is. It is an investigation of sorts of church culture, of world culture, of what it feels like in the U.S., how that interacts with hierarchy and power. So many systems all collide under this idea of hierarchy. And hierarchy is what birthed the Holy Hothead. So let's go back to the beginning. I was a pastor's wife. Well, preacher's wife, as we said back then, minister's wife. We didn't actually say pastor, but that's a whole nother conversation. We'll probably get to that next time. But I was a minister's wife in the Churches of Christ. And for the 18 years that I was in the Church of Christ, the messaging felt very simple, but it was very covert as well, at least for the women. And honestly, there's so many women that are still there that still don't see it the way I see it now, but I honestly didn't see it until I left and looked back. But it was be less, be invisible, be lower, allow space for your husband to shine, make room for where God is taking him, support his goals, support his calling, do all of the things that he doesn't have time to do while he's doing the important work of ministry. Those were the lines and the messages that would float in my mind constantly. And so, like I said, I was in that church for 18 years. 9 of those, my husband was a minister. And I found myself going from being a bubbly, ambitious, outgoing, intelligent, creative, and very opinionated late teenager. I was 17 when I got baptized. And over the years, it just morphed into this angry, somewhat quieter, definitely less ambitious version of myself who would constantly tell myself that I had made these decisions because it was the will of God. And I didn't realize how much of me I was losing because I thought I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. I was an artist who never picked up a paintbrush for about 15 years. I had children. I have 4 children who I adore. Let's not get that twisted. I love my kids. But I decided to homeschool them. And I felt like that was a calling. It was what God was requiring of me at that time. But it wasn't necessarily a gift. So there was a lot of struggle in that. My kids are exceptional. They were definitely blessed by the time that we were able to homeschool, and I'm thankful for that. But we all struggled during some of those years. Toward the end of our homeschool years, we learned and realized, well, then and recently, that all 4 of my children have ADHD. I also have ADHD, and 2 of my children are high masking on the autism spectrum. And so when we had struggles in homeschooling, it wasn't because I was failing or I wasn't good at this or I needed to be more like sister so-and-so and better than this person, something like along those lines. But it was something that I was struggling with because of a diagnosis that had been swept under the rug and nobody ever knew that I also was ADHD. That was rough. But so as I learned more about me and about them, I realized that this was definitely not the best case scenario for any of us. And so I am thankful to say that they're in private school now and they're doing better. There's definitely more complications there, but we're figuring it out. But for me as a minister's wife, there was like this overarching belief that I was expected to continually push myself to stretch and be better and more godly and sacrifice more without realizing how much it was impacting me. I was constantly looking down on myself when my house wasn't clean. And I would look at my kids if they were misbehaving during worship service, not because I actually believed that it needed to be any different than what it was, but because I could see and feel the eyes that were expecting us to be better. I remember I was talking with a woman once, and she was not at service or something, and I called her just to talk to her, see how she was doing. And she said something like, well, of course you have to be there. Your husband's one of the ministers. And I'm like, why do we have to be there and you don't have to be there? And she's like, well, because your husband's a minister. He has to be there. Like, I don't have to be there. And that was what she actually believed. And it was somewhere in that conversation that I realized, I'm like, the standards are so different for us, so unfairly so. And there's nothing I can do about that. So fast forward to the beginning of when the changes began to happen in our lives. Man, life was rough. Life was rough. We had a very rough season of our marriage. That was at the tail end of one of our pregnancies. And I remember I went to a therapist and I told him, I'm here because I don't want my husband in the room when this child is born. My son was late. I'm very confident that it's because I was so angry the week of his due date that my body couldn't even comprehend the idea of letting him out in that moment. That entire pregnancy was difficult. It was very tense for me and my husband. His work life was terrible. Our extended family life was a train wreck. It was terrible, truly. So we started seeing a therapist and things started to get better. I was very thankful for that. Our son was born, totally healthy home birth. But then several months later, I learned of my husband's addiction to pornography. And that sent shockwaves through my belief system, through my identity, through my confidence, and most certainly through our marriage and our family. I so desperately wish I could say that I totally leaned into healing at that point, but I absolutely did not. Nope, not at all. I leaned into what was familiar and what I was very, very good at, stuffing it. I look back at my journals now, and there were so many random journal entries where I was fussing about things that Keith had done or would do. He didn't wash the dishes, and he didn't do this, and nothing about a porn addiction. Like, it's my journal, and I said nothing in my journal about the porn addiction until months later. And so looking back, I realized now that I was so deep in denial at that point that the idea of even writing the word pornography terrified me. I couldn't imagine even putting that word on paper. What if somebody saw it? What if that made it more real than it was inside of my own mind? And I couldn't do that. But God decided that I had to. I got pregnant again. And during that pregnancy, my emotions were so open and raw and honest. And Keith was so gentle and so sweet during that pregnancy. But it forced us to confront what it was that we were doing, what we were sitting in terms of our marriage and ultimately in terms of our church. Yeah, that was an interesting time. When our daughter was about 3 months old, Keith started going to Celebrate Recovery. When she was about 7 or 8 months old, I started going. And I did not believe that I belonged there, that I needed it, that there was any reason for me to be there. But God did. I was angry. And my anger was starting to come out. I was yelling at our kids about really silly things. They were very young at the time. And so it was very easy to see when I was being irrational, but it was still hard to control. And so I would see myself yelling at my 2-year-old, my 3-year-old, my 5-year-old. And I'm like, okay, Uwem, this is not working. You got to do something different because it's not their fault that you're angry. And I went to a meeting and another and another and another. And the crazy thing was, like, I would sit there and I'd be frustrated that I couldn't tell all these women what was wrong with their relationships in their lives, because my wisdom was clear. I knew the Bible forwards and backwards, as they say. And if they had only listened to me, they'd be fine. But thanks to the structure of recovery support groups, I couldn't say anything. So I learned to listen. I did not realize what a horrible listener I was until I was in that space. But I'm so thankful for it, because I learned how to close my mouth and hear the hearts and the needs of other people. I learned to understand where they were coming from, both in their past, in their perspective, and also where God might be taking them. The lessons that are woven in our stories are intricate and sometimes seem completely strange, but it's not ours to figure out. That's God's job. I learned that in those spaces. So now I'm sitting in a recovery group at a church that's different than the one that my husband is a minister in. And I'm realizing that I love this space. I feel safe in this space. I keep coming back to this space month after month after month, week after week, and even day after day. I'm sending text messages to these women, and I'm developing relationships that are profoundly deeper than anything I had ever experienced in any friendship or quote unquote church sister, whatever. And I realized that something was very off with the church that we were sitting in. The fact that I could be in so much pain and not feel safe to tell any of my supposed friends or sisters in Christ. The fact that my first concern when I learned of my husband's pornography addiction was, I don't ever want to hear about this from a pulpit at all, ever. This will never be in a sermon. Do you understand? Like, that's the response that I had, because the terror that I had in my heart was about them finding out. Not about the state of my marriage, not even about how my husband was doing. I was embarrassed, and I didn't want them to know, because I knew that it would ruin our lives, our reputation, his position, and I didn't want that. And there are so many layers to that. Why isn't the church the place that we're able to feel safe? That was the question that came up first. And then, why do I not feel safe with these women? Why do I not know these women? How have I been sitting in these women's kitchens and having Christmas dinners at their houses, and I don't even know what they're scared of, besides the normal thing that we're all scared of, people finding out too much about our families. And so the solution that I came up with was, well, let's start small groups. And not like the traditional small groups, come over and eat and we'll talk about a scripture, but like, let's kind of dig into who we are a little bit. And it was nowhere near what I was experiencing in the recovery groups, but it was kind of like the bridge in between. So I launched a 5-year plan that I created to take this church from this very conservative, emotionally stuffing, very inauthentic environment to a place where people could say, you know what, I heard what the sermon was talking about, but this is how it hit me. Just to give them a space to learn how to talk about those things. We launched it, and it was beautiful. We were so hopeful and so excited. Then we expanded it from this small group that had committed to being leaders with us into doing it, throughout the entire congregation. And the very first day we had 99 people. And honestly, that blew my mind. I did not expect people to actually show up for this, so I was pretty astounded. But then the following week, it was like 60, and then maybe like 40. But that last 30 or 40 people, they stayed, and we did really beautiful work with them. But there was one day that one of the elders' wives came to me, and she was in a fury. This is probably one of the quietest women I have ever known. Her and I never talked about anything, and she came to me so flustered and in such a rage. I attempted to talk with her. I honestly just don't really even know what made her that angry. But the idea of sharing at this level, or being forced to share at this level, I think as she put it, bothered her. And I tried to talk to her. I tried to let her know. I'm like, you share at the level that you're comfortable. If you walk in and you say, I had a hard time putting my shoes on this morning because my knee hurt, that's fine. This is your world. You do what you want. And she couldn't hear that. And that same, I think it was like within that same month at least, my husband had a similar conversation with one of the men. And he said to him, you have no idea the kind of secrets that we have. You're going to ruin marriages. And like when my husband told me that, I was like, oh, so these people are hiding things from each other that they don't want each other to know. And they think that somehow our magical powers are going to yank them out of them and they're going to reveal their deep, dark secrets and ruin their marriages. And it's going to somehow be our fault. So it was very eye-opening what we were sitting in. But we definitely felt the power of God in that space. And we knew we were doing exactly what we were supposed to be doing, because we and everyone else felt it. The sad thing about hierarchy, though, is that when a person feels threatened, I think it's when the spirit begins to move and they realize that this might not be in their control anymore, hierarchy starts to flare up. And so one day, again, we were doing great within the groups, and it was a beautiful movement that was happening, and it was very, very exciting. The lead minister essentially cornered me in a hallway one day, and he told me that we were not going to have the meeting that day because it collided with the ministry that he had been running for 20 years. This ministry was about 10 or 12 of the leading families or leading couples, I guess, would sit in a circle and brainstorm activities they were going to do with the church that month. And I'm sorry, it was quite laughable because this group, they would meet monthly and they would sit there and say, hey, we should show this movie because this is really important and we need to have, people need to know about this. And, hey, how about, well, the 4th of July is coming up and we should throw a potluck and, oh yeah, we can have brother so-and-so barbecue. Yeah, man, because brother so-and-so, he can tear it up on that grill, man. And sometimes they would be completely, good events. Most of the time it was a potluck because Lord knows that churchmen are heavily addicted to food. But he was adamant that this meeting was critical, even though they had been meeting for years and had done nothing really, like just a whole bunch of random events that most people didn't come to unless it was a large potluck with a barbecue. And so he wanted to cancel the groups that I was running, which members were coming to. When I talked to him about it, I unfortunately have always believed in my own voice. I silenced it for a long time, but I never stopped believing that my voice was important. And so I thought in this moment that I could talk to him. I forgot, or at least I didn't realize then how strong the pull of hierarchy was when a person feels threatened. I learned quickly. And so I was sharing, I'm like, well, how about you have your meeting and when you're done, they can come over to our meeting. It's not really a conflict. It happens at the same time, but it's not a big deal. And no, I don't think that we should cancel it because there are members who are coming. We're trying to develop a habit or routine and we want to provide the space for people that need it, especially if they already think that they're coming. And yeah, it wasn't a logical conversation. It was a power play. He was telling me, your meeting is canceled because my meeting takes precedence. And I didn't know that or like that. So he got a little elevated and I got angry and we kind of separated. It wasn't a big blow up in that moment, but it was definitely noticeable that we were both pretty heated. So I went to go talk to my husband about it and he went to go talk to him about it. Now you have two men who are both leaders. One is a lead minister, so he has his hierarchy all fluttered up. And then there's my husband, who's an associate minister, essentially rebuking him. And that did not go well. The first and only time that I heard yelling in that church was that day. And the two of them were so pissed. It was interesting, though. because that was the day that I vividly will always remember as the moment that it felt like a different spirit was moving in his heart, the other minister. And things never changed back after that. Every single step that we took, it was oppositional with him. Everything that we did, it was confrontational with him. And it was his decision to end the groups. Not overtly, but he pretty much choked us out. It was a very hurtful time because I knew what we were doing was important, and I saw the hearts of the people who needed it. I saw the level of sharing that was happening there, and it was beautiful, and such beautiful, powerful things were happening, and it was only in its infancy, But it was hierarchy that crushed it. So I say all that to say, when you think in terms of hierarchy, there is a social ladder. Everyone is aware of it. We all know about it. We don't talk about it, though. We just kind of know, right? There are certain people who can say certain things, can do certain things, and there is nothing that other people could ever do to change those certain things, right? Whether it is related to race, socioeconomic class, age, gender, height. There are so many ways that we, all of us, attempt to level ourselves up by pushing someone else down. A prime example of this is when you meet someone new. This typically happens with men, not so much with women, but sometimes. But typically when men meet each other, they ask, "Hey, so what do you do?" It seems like a very benign question, right? Most of us, I'm positive, have asked it at one time or another. Something that I've noticed, though, is when you ask that question, what is the motivation? It might be curiosity, but there might be something a little bit more subliminal underneath that question. Where do you fit? Because if that person tells you that they're an unemployed artist who lives in their mom's basement, there's an opinion now that you're going to create about that person based on that information. If this person tells you that they are a CEO of a Fortune 500 company and they bring in $3.3 million a year, you're going to have a very different view of that person than you would if they were an unemployed artist in their mother's basement. Hierarchy. So what do you do? Most of the time, something that happens on the inside of us says, where do they fit on the ladder in comparison to me based on how they answer? And we start to decide, where do they fit? Where do I fit? If we're on the same level, now there's a comfortable conversation that's had. But if they are significantly lower, very different conversation. Usually the conversation's over and you're going to move on to somebody else in the party that's going to be closer to your level. If the person is considerably higher than you, you're now going to feel like you have to tell them the things that will bump you up on the ladder so that you are now somewhat equal-ish to them so that they don't have the urge to walk away from you. Hierarchy. These things play in such small ways that most of us don't even take the time to notice what it is that we're doing or why. But this is where self-reflection, healing, recovery, shadow work, journaling, self-awareness, all of these words start to come into play, because when you understand who you are, then you can start to say, oh, that's what I was doing. I felt insecure while I was talking to that person, so I started telling them all of my successes so that I would not feel so small in their presence. It kind of messes with the system, though, because the system is built on hierarchy. We all got to know our place. And when you don't know your place and you start messing stuff up and you expect that the $3.3 million CEO is going to listen to you while you're an unemployed artist living in your mother's basement, there's going to be some problems. So this is where Holy Hothead was born. As we were healing, I started to see myself as significant, as valuable, as a gift to the spaces that God put me in. God put me here for a purpose. God gave me these gifts and these ideas and these thoughts and these things that live on the inside of me for a reason. I very strongly believed in those groups because I saw it in real time how powerful it was. So when I collide with someone who believes that they are higher up on a hierarchy than I am, and I don't agree with that, our conversation is going to get very uncomfortable, because where he thinks submission is required, I'm going to tell you what I think. Sometimes it can be forceful. Sometimes it needs to be forceful. But most of the time, it's respectful. It just doesn't matter how it comes out, because it's still out of place if you don't understand your place in the hierarchy. I know, that's kind of loaded, isn't it? When you realize how valuable you are in the eyes of God, but then you collide with people who don't see that, that shit will piss you off. Hence, holy hothead. I understand who I am. God has spent the last decade walking with me through recovery and healing and self-discovery, self-love, so that I can see myself beautifully and powerfully and bigly. But then I have to enter spaces like that one and so many others that have come along the way since. And it is aggravating and infuriating to realize that there are people in this world who are convinced that you are less than them, that you don't deserve to speak in their presence, and that you have nothing to offer them, when you know that you do. It'll make you kind of hot. So I have people a lot of time asking me, why holy hothead? Because it's very eek. On the outset, when you hear it, it's kind of like, I don't know if I want to talk to her. She might be crazy. But that's why I prefaced it with holy. Yeah, I am for sure a hothead. 1000%, always have been. But I spent 18 years telling that girl to be quiet. During the more recent years, though, God has reminded me, I put that fire in you for a reason. As long as it's in his hands, it does phenomenal work, like those groups that I did. When my hot-headedness is in his hands, it's the Spirit working through me. That's the holy part. I do the thing that God's Spirit calls me to do. And I'm okay with the conflict that comes along with it, because I can hold my own. Whether that be in a Bible discussion or an actual argument, I can hold my own. Not in a hurtful way, but in a very clear and direct way. There's a lot of holy hotheads in the world, and most of us have been conditioned by a church system that absolutely loves silence, to hush it, to silence it, to squish it down, because hot-headedness is not godliness. Godliness is godliness. But I have to say, Christ had a lot of holy hotheads in his camp. Every time that I read about Peter, I smile and I feel so seen and loved and valued, because I know that Jesus chose Peter for a reason. And his hot-headedness might have been part of it. Because when you're doing something, a movement of the magnitude of what God has placed on the inside of my heart and my imagination, there's going to be a lot of pushback. Like with that pastor who did not like the idea of my group getting in the way of his group. You got to push. There are things that holy hotheads need to do in this world that will absolutely change the lives of everyone that has ever been born. But we have to be willing to see ourselves and allow others to hear us with all of the fire and all of the confidence and all of the Spirit-led drive that we have. So that is me. That is a holy hothead. I want to do the thing that God has called me to do, even when it pushes up against hierarchy, because I know that hierarchy was never God's plan. But that we'll talk about next time. Have a great week.